I want you to try a really quick exercise with me. Just for a second, I want you to picture a narcissist in your mind's eye.
Right. And if you are like, the vast majority of people, the image that immediately flashes into your brain is probably quite loud.
Oh, exactly. You are likely picturing someone distinctly arrogant. Maybe it's the person sitting at the head of the boardroom table just completely dominating the conversation.
Yeah, the one sucking all the oxygen out of the room.
Right. Or maybe it's that person you get cornered by at a dinner party who just will not stop boasting about their new sports car, or their brilliant investments, or just their sheer unadulterated genius.
It's the classic, almost cinematic villain version of the personality structure. I mean, it's highly visible.
Right. We are culturally conditioned to view narcissism as this aggressive, in-your-face kind of grandiosity.
Yeah, it is socially disruptive in a very overt way. And because of that, it's actually quite easy to spot. And if necessary, to walk away from. You see the arrogance coming from a mile away.
But here's the question that entirely reframes this picture. What if the most destructive narcissist in your life doesn't look anything like that?
That is a terrifying thought for a lot of people.
It really is. What if the person who is doing the most profound psychological damage to you is actually, well, the person shrinking into the corner of the room?
Right.
I'm talking about the person who claims to be highly sensitive, the one who insists they are chronically misunderstood, and who seems to be perpetually victimized by the world.
The ultimate victim.
Exactly. What if that person, beneath the tears and the apparent fragility, is secretly harboring a profound, unshakable sense of superiority? Like, what if the ultimate victim in your life is actually the ultimate narcissist?
That is the central paradox we are confronting in our source material today. We're looking at a psychological profile that essentially weaponizes vulnerability.
Weaponizes vulnerability.
Yeah. It is a structure that uses the appearance of weakness to exert just an incredible amount of control over the people around them.
And that is exactly the mission of this deep dive into our source material today. We have an absolutely massive stack of literature in front of us.
We really do. We are pulling from clinical psychology papers, the DSM-5 alternative models for personality disorders,
Cutting-edge neuroscience research, and some really heavy trauma literature, too.
right? And we're going to synthesize all of this to deconstruct what the clinical world calls covert or vulnerable narcissism.
So if you are listening to this right now, I can promise you a real journey of discovery. We are going to decode the hidden truths behind human behavior, emotional manipulation, and toxic relationships.
Our goal is to explain those baffling patterns of behavior that you may have spent your entire life trying to understand.
Or worse, patterns that you have been secretly blaming yourself for.
Exactly. But to really get to the bottom of this, we have to commit to looking past the superficial behaviors.
Right, like the crying or the social withdrawal.
Yeah, the constant self-deprecation. Those are just the surface level presentation. If we only look at what the person is doing, well, we will be completely fooled.
Because they're good at the disguise.
Incredibly good. We have to examine the unconscious psychological engines that are actually driving those behaviors.
I think to even begin to understand how someone can be secretly narcissistic, we have to look at the history of how this concept even developed. Because for a long time, it seems like the psychiatric community totally missed this, right?
They absolutely did. For decades, the focus was skewed. Psychiatry heavily focused on the exhibitionist because, frankly, those are the people causing the most obvious disruptions.
The squeaky wheels.
Exactly. But a major shift happened around 1989. A prominent psychiatrist named Glenn Gabbard published some groundbreaking observations.
Oh, right. I read about this.
Yeah, he started writing about a distinction he was seeing in his practice between what he called the oblivious narcissist and the hypervigilant narcissist.
That phrasing is really interesting because oblivious implies the loud guy at the party who just has no idea he's ignoring everyone.
Right.
But hypervigilant implies someone who is intensely tuned in.
Precisely. Gabbard noticed that some of his highly narcissistic patients weren't oblivious at all. Instead, they were acutely, painfully sensitive to the reactions of others.
Like they were constantly scanning the room.
Yes, constantly looking for any sign of slight or rejection. They were quiet, they were inhibited, but their internal world was entirely consumed by their own exceptionalism.
And how the world was basically failing to recognize it.
Exactly. Then, a couple years later in 1991, a researcher named Paul Wink took Gabbard's clinical observations and put them to a rigorous statistical test.
This is the MMPI study in our notes, right? The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
That's the one.
And I know from reading the background that the MMPI isn't just like some magazine quiz. This is a massive, highly respected personality assessment.
Oh, it is one of the most robust psychological instruments we have. It's used in everything from clinical diagnosis to high-level security clearances.
Wow.
Yeah, it consists of hundreds of true or false questions designed to map out complex personality traits. It can even catch inconsistencies if a person is trying to lie to the test.
That's fascinating. So what did Wink find with this data?
Wink conducted a seminal empirical analysis,
Yeah.
and he proved statistically that narcissism actually has what he called two faces.
So the data completely backed up the clinical observation. You have the overt face and the covert face.
Yes, the overt or grandiose narcissism is marked by high extroversion and very low neuroticism.
And neuroticism in the psychological sense, that refers to negative emotional states, right? Like anxiety, fear, moodiness.
Exactly. The grandiose narcissist doesn't have much of that. They genuinely feel great about themselves, and they overtly express their superiority.
Right. They love themselves, and they want you to know it.
But Wink found that the other face, covert or vulnerable narcissism, presents completely differently. This profile is marked by introversion and exceptionally high neuroticism.
So a lot of anxiety and moodiness.
A ton of it, plus extreme defensiveness and an exhausting internal pendulum. Their internal state constantly swings between feelings of excessive, almost delusional pride and deep, toxic shame.
I want to clarify something here because I found myself getting a little confused when I was initially reading through the DSM-5 criteria versus the covert research.
Sure, it can be a lot to untangle.
Because clinical theorists like Kernberg and Horowitz, they note that these aren't necessarily two entirely different species of human, right?
Right, they're not completely separate boxes.
You can have someone who generally acts like a loud, grandiose narcissist, but then they experience a massive public failure and they just collapse into a vulnerable state.
That's a crucial point. Grandiosity and vulnerability can coexist and oscillate within the same person.
Okay, so it's more fluid.
It's much better to think of them as a spectrum of defensive expressions, rather than fixed, immutable categories. A grandiose person might suffer a narcissistic injury.
Like getting fired or being rejected by a partner.
Exactly. And suddenly they present with intense vulnerable traits. But for many individuals, the vulnerable covert expression becomes their primary, chronic way of operating in the world.
Here's where I really have to push back on the terminology, though, because I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone trying to apply this to a relationship in their own life.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you look at the strict diagnostic criteria, the defining trait of narcissistic personality disorder is a grandiose sense of self-importance, a belief that they are fundamentally superior.
Right, that is the core criterion.
So if I have someone in my life who constantly puts themselves down, who is always saying, I'm so terrible at this, I'm such a burden to you, I can't do anything right.
Yeah, the classic self-deprecating script.
Exactly. How on earth can that person be classified as having a grandiose sense of self-importance? It feels like a total paradox.
It absolutely seems like a paradox on the surface. And, it will continue to confuse you until you understand the unconscious psychological mechanism at play.
What's the mechanism?
In psychoanalytic terms, clinicians refer to this mechanism as the horizontal split.
A horizontal split. Okay, I'm imagining a literal physical wall dividing a space. How does that actually work inside someone's mind?
Imagine the psyche as a multi-level structure. Deep down, the covert narcissist possesses the exact same core belief in their own exceptionalism as the grandiose narcissist.
Really? They actually believe they are special.
They truly believe they are uniquely special, misunderstood geniuses. Or maybe they think they're inherently more moral and sensitive than the rest of humanity. That is their grandiosity.
Wow, okay. But it's buried.
Exactly. Unlike the grandiose narcissist, their overall sense of self is incredibly fragile, fragmented, and haunted by a profound fear of inadequacy.
So they have this massive ego, but it's built on a foundation of sand.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. Now think about the risk involved if they were to express that grandiosity overtly.
Oh, like if they just walked out into the world and announced, I am a genius, I am the most sensitive and brilliant person here.
Right. The world is very likely to push back. People might criticize them, ignore them, or tell them they are just wrong.
And for a healthy person, criticism stings, but you move on.
But for a covert narcissist, That rejection would cause a catastrophic, unbearable psychological collapse. They literally cannot tolerate the shame of being exposed as ordinary.
So what do?
To protect themselves from the agonizing risk of failure or criticism, their mind creates this horizontal split. They push the grandiosity down below the surface, into the unconscious or semi-conscious realm, and they build a defensive wall over it.
They're essentially hiding their own superiority from the world in order to protect it from being challenged.
Exactly.
That makes so much sense. But if the grandiosity is hidden away behind this wall, how do they get their needs met?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because reading through the literature, it's clear they still have the exact same hidden emotional need as the loud narcissist. They still desperately require narcissistic supply, right?
Yes. They need the validation, the attention, the adoration from others just to regulate their baseline self-esteem.
That is the core of the pathology, isn't it? The need for supply doesn't go away just because the grandiosity is hidden.
It doesn't go away at all. But because they are too socially anxious, inhibited, or fear-driven to stand up and demand adoration openly, they have to develop indirect methods.
Highly manipulative methods.
Very manipulative. They have to extract it from the people around them without asking for it directly.
And this is where the self-deprecation comes in. It's not actually low self-esteem, it's a tactic.
Yes, precisely.
I'm thinking of a hypothetical scenario. Say you have a friend who is an artist, they paint something, and you know it's objectively good.
Okay.
But instead of saying, I'm proud of this, they come to you looking miserable and say, this is absolute garbage, I have no talent, I should just throw my brushes away, I'm such a fraud.
I think we've all known someone who does exactly that.
When they do that, it is not coming from genuine humility, is it? Or a desire to authentically connect over their insecurity.
It is not. It is a calculated, though often unconscious, maneuver to force you into a specific conversational role.
They are forcing a script on you.
Exactly. When they call themselves garbage, they are essentially fishing for compliments, but with a highly manipulative edge. They want to create a situation where you feel socially obligated to rush in and rescue them.
They want you to passionately disagree with them.
They need you to say, no, what are you talking about? You're amazing. This painting is brilliant. You are so talented. Please don't stop painting.
Wow. They are weaponizing a victim mentality to trick you into providing the validation they are too afraid to ask for directly.
That's exactly it.
It's a way of forcing you to affirm their hidden grandiosity without them having to take the risk of stating it themselves.
And this is where we have to talk about how this profoundly affects the victims. The partners, the children, the close friends of these individuals.
Right, because if you are interacting with someone employing these tactics, it doesn't feel like a mutually supportive relationship.
Not at all. It feels like an exhausting, never-ending chore.
Because your energy is being totally consumed by the unspoken job of propping up their fragile ego. I know so many listeners are probably recognizing this dynamic right now in their own lives.
It's very common, unfortunately.
You aren't having a reciprocal friendship or romance. You are functioning as an emotional life support machine for their self-esteem.
That is a brutally accurate way to describe it.
It's a one-way street where your job is to constantly reassure them, validate their victimhood, and soothe their endless manufactured crises.
And the way you can differentiate this from someone who is genuinely depressed and just needs support is what happens when you fail to provide the exact script they demand.
Oh, this is the scary part. What happens if you are exhausted one day and you don't offer the effusive praise?
Or what if you gently agree with their self-criticism?
Like if they say, I'm always messing things up, and you say, well, we all make mistakes, maybe we can work on that together. What is the reaction?
I think you can guess based on the literature.
It's not relief, it's rage or extreme passive aggression.
The reaction is usually a sudden, venomous resentment, intense sulking, or the silent treatment.
Just for agreeing with them.
Yes, because by agreeing with them or by failing to rush in with adoration, you have failed to play your assigned role in their internal play. You threaten the horizontal split.
You let their self-deprecation stand as truth.
Exactly, rather than contradicting it with praise. And that triggers an immediate hostile defense.
That dynamic is just so draining to even think about. But it leads me to a really disturbing question about how they view the people around them.
Okay, let's go there.
Because if covert narcissists are so incredibly fragile and so hyper-focused on their own internal pain and their need for supply, how are they so good at pushing people's buttons?
Ah, that is the empathy paradox.
Right. If you talk to victims of this kind of abuse, they often describe their partner as someone who knows exactly what to say to cut them to the absolute core.
Yes. They're very precise.
How does someone who is entirely self-obsessed know exactly how to manipulate their victims so perfectly?
That brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissism as a whole. And it's a distinction that the clinical neuroscience is finally starting to clarify for us.
Because the common wisdom, the cliche we always hear, is that narcissists entirely lack empathy.
Right, you hear that everywhere.
Yeah.
But the reality of how their brains process social information is far more complex and, frankly, far more unsettling.
I was reading the DSM-5 alternative model for personality disorders that was included in the sources, and it explicitly addresses this. It breaks empathy down into different components.
It does, which is a huge step forward in the field.
Can you explain the difference between the types of empathy? Because I think people use the word empathy as a catch-all for just being a good person.
That's a great place to start. We need to distinguish between cognitive empathy and affective empathy.
Okay, cognitive empathy first. What is that?
Cognitive empathy is the intellectual ability to read and understand another person's emotional state. It is essentially mind reading.
So it's intellectual, not emotional.
Right. It's the capacity to look at someone's face, read their body language, listen to their tone, and accurately deduce that person is sad or that person is feeling insecure right now.
So it's purely data collection. It's recognizing the state, but not necessarily doing anything with it.
Exactly. Affective empathy, on the other hand, is the emotional resonance.
The feeling part.
Yes. It is the ability to physically feel and care about that person's distress. If you see someone crying, cognitive empathy tells you they are sad. Affective empathy is the mechanism that makes your own heart ache because they are sad.
And that ache is what creates the genuine desire to comfort them.
Precisely.
So when the literature says narcissists lack empathy, they are talking specifically about affective empathy. They lack the emotional resonance.
Correct.
Yeah.
But they do not lack cognitive empathy.
In fact, the author Sam Vaknin coined a brilliant term for this phenomenon that really stuck with me. He calls it cold empathy.
Cold empathy, it is the perfect descriptor.
It is empathy devoid of warmth, compassion, or emotional weight.
They can clearly see the data of your emotions, but they do not feel the music of them.
The analogy that immediately jumped into my mind when I was trying to process this concept was, well, a master safecracker.
Oh, I like that. Walk me through it.
Think about the mechanics of breaking into a vault. A safecracker will sit there for hours, pressing their ear to the metal, listening to the tiny clicks of the tumblers.
Right. Very focused.
They study the mechanisms, they find the vulnerabilities, they know exactly what makes the lock tick. But they aren't doing that incredibly intimate, detailed work because they want to protect the valuables inside your vault.
No, they want what's inside for themselves.
Exactly. They're doing it because they want to figure out the combination so they can open the door and rob you blind. A covert narcissist uses cognitive empathy to figure out the combination to your emotional vault.
The safecracker analogy is powerful, and it gets us a long way toward understanding the mechanics of the manipulation. However, I do want to add a layer of clinical nuance to it.
Please do.
The idea of a safecracker implies a level of conscious, mustache-twirling villainy, someone who sits down with a deliberate, malicious plan to destroy you.
And that's not always the case.
While that can happen, especially with psychopathic traits with covert narcissism, this safecracking is often a deeply ingrained, almost automatic survival mechanism.
So they aren't necessarily plotting it out on a whiteboard.
Right, they aren't necessarily plotting your downfall in a conscious way. Rather, they are desperately, constantly managing their own fragile internal state, and they use their cognitive empathy as a tool to do that.
But the behavioral science completely backs up the point about the disconnect between understanding and caring, right?
Oh, absolutely. There were some specific studies in the materials that highlighted this disconnect beautifully.
The one that really stood out to me was a study by researchers Hepper, Hart, and Sedekades. They wanted to test how narcissists actually respond to another person's pain, rather than just how they say they respond.
Yes, this study perfectly illustrates the gap between self-reporting and reality.
What did they do?
The researchers first had the narcissistic participants fill out questionnaires evaluating their own empathy. Predictably, they self-reported having totally normal or even above average levels of empathy.
Of course. Covert narcissists, in particular, often view themselves as highly empathetic and sensitive people.
Exactly. But then came the behavioral test. The researchers sat the participants down and showed them a harrowing 10-minute documentary featuring a woman who had survived severe domestic violence.
Oh, wow. And she was describing her trauma on screen.
Yes, in detail. And what did they find when they measured the participants' physiological and emotional responses to the video?
The self-reports entirely fell apart.
Completely. While healthy control subjects exhibited strong emotional and physiological signs of distress and compassion while watching the survivor, the highly narcissistic subjects showed a profound lack of effective response.
Their heart rates didn't elevate in sympathy.
No, their self-reported distress for the victim was remarkably low. They understood what the woman was saying, but it simply did not move the emotional needle inside them.
Like we said earlier, they saw the data, but they didn't feel the music.
Exactly.
But it gets even deeper and honestly a bit more unnerving when we look at performance-based tasks. The source material mentions the MASC and the MET. What are those, and what do they tell us about covert narcissists?
The MASC stands for the Movie for the Assessment of Social Cognition, and the MET is the Multifaceted Empathy Test.
Okay, so instead of just asking people how empathetic they are?
Right. These tests measure how accurately people can read emotions in real time. In the MET, for example, participants are shown a series of photographs of people's faces displaying complex emotional states.
And they have to quickly identify what the person is feeling.
Yes. And this is where the research takes a truly shocking turn. The data shows that in these performance-based tasks, covert narcissists do not perform worse than average.
Wait, really?
In fact, they actually show enhanced cognitive empathy, specifically for negative emotional expressions.
That is wild. They are actually better than the average person at spotting when someone is sad, anxious, or fearful.
It is a stunning finding. They are hyper-attuned to negative emotions.
But why? Why would a narcissist, someone entirely focused on themselves, develop a superpower for spotting when I'm feeling insecure?
We have to trace it back to the psychological engine driving them, the horizontal split, and their overwhelming fragility.
So it goes back to the fear.
Yes. Because they are so incredibly terrified of being exposed or rejected, their nervous system is in a constant state of hypervigilance. They are compulsively scanning the social environment for two very specific things.
What's the first thing?
First, they're looking for any potential threats to their precarious self-esteem. If they can spot your irritation or anger before you even voice it, they can launch a preemptive defensive strike.
Or they can withdraw to protect themselves.
Exactly.
And the second thing they're scanning for?
They are scanning for vulnerabilities they can exploit for narcissistic supply.
Ah, there's the safe cracking.
Right. If they have a heightened ability to read your insecurity or your guilt, they know exactly which emotional button to push to make you feel small.
And remember, making you feel small temporarily makes them feel superior, which feeds their hidden grandiosity.
Yes. Or they know exactly what to say to make you doubt yourself and feel dependent on them. Their enhanced cognitive empathy is a radar system designed to locate the cracks in your armor.
That is just profound. And I think there is a deeply important lesson here for anyone listening who might be caught in this kind of dynamic.
What's the takeaway for them?
We are taught that if someone truly sees us, if they understand our deepest fears and can articulate our pain, it must mean they love us.
That is a very common belief.
But what the clinical science is showing us is that the ability to read your mind does not equate to having a heart. Just because someone understands your pain does not mean they care about your pain.
That is a harsh but necessary reality to accept. The covert narcissist isn't clumsily hurting you because they are oblivious to your feelings.
Their cognitive empathy allows them to precisely map your emotional landscape.
And their lack of effective empathy allows them to weaponize that map against you without feeling the burden of guilt.
This naturally leads us to question the origins of all of this. I mean, how does a human brain develop this incredibly specific, highly destructive division?
It's a vital question.
How does a person learn to read emotions like a hypervigilant safecracker while entirely shutting down the internal machinery required to feel them? People aren't born like this, right?
You're right, they are not born this way. Narcissism is a developmental arrest.
So we have to look at the developmental origins of this pathology.
The origins are deeply rooted in early attachment injuries, and the structure typically solidifies and emerges in late childhood or early adolescence.
So we are talking about childhood trauma.
Yes.
When we hear trauma, we usually think of severe emotional abuse or physical neglect. And the sources indicate that those are certainly common pathways.
They are. Emotional neglect is a huge factor.
But the literature also points out a really surprising alternative route to narcissism.
Yes, it can stem from emotional neglect, a child whose emotional needs were completely ignored by their primary caregivers. But uniquely, Narcissism can also develop from the exact opposite extreme,
Which is
excessive conditional praise.
conditional praise. This is the golden child syndrome, right?
Exactly. The child who is constantly told they are a genius, they are better than everyone else, they are special.
But it's not genuine, unconditional love. They are only praised when they are performing perfectly to prop up the parent's own fragile ego.
That's the key. The parent doesn't love the child for who they authentically are. The parent loves the child as an extension of themselves, a trophy to be shown off.
So you have two completely different environments on the surface. In one house, a child is ignored and neglected. In the other house, a child is put on a pedestal and praised as a genius.
It seems contradictory.
What is the common denominator between those two extremes? What is the actual unconscious mechanism that gets broken in both scenarios, leading to the exact same narcissistic outcome?
The common denominator is a profound failure of the environment to provide a safe space for the child to develop internal self-regulation.
Self-regulation. How does that normally develop?
In healthy development, caregivers engage in what we call mirroring. When a toddler falls down and scrapes their knee, they look at the parent.
To see how they should react.
Right. If the parent offers calm, soothing validation, "I know that hurts, you're okay, I'm here," the child learns to internalize that soothing voice.
They build their own internal toolkit.
Over time, they build the internal psychological hardware to manage their own frustration, soothe their own anxieties, and process shame internally.
But if the parent is neglectful, there is no one there to mirror the emotions. The child is left alone in a terrifying void of unregulated emotion.
Yes, and if the parent is offering conditional praise, they aren't mirroring the child's true self. They are only mirroring the performance.
In both cases, the authentic self is completely abandoned.
Precisely. Because the caregivers failed to provide that crucial emotional scaffolding, the child's capacity for internal self-regulation was severely disrupted or never built at all.
The engine for self-worth is entirely missing from their internal architecture.
That is exactly what happens. It leads to a lifelong parasitic reliance on other people for emotional regulation.
So if you don't have the internal engine to regulate your own self-esteem and process your own shame, what do? You have to outsource it.
You have to. The covert narcissist needs you to regulate their self-esteem, to constantly reassure them, to absorb their projected shame.
Yeah.
Because they literally do not possess the internal psychological hardware to do it themselves.
I want to talk about how this actually manifests in the body, because the physiological research mentioned in our sources is just staggering.
It really recontextualizes the behavior.
It proves that this isn't just an attitude problem, it's a profound nervous system dysregulation. There were studies tracking the stress responses of covert narcissists in highly evaluated situations. What did they find?
Researchers put subjects into stressful scenarios, specifically evaluative tasks like mock job interviews, where their performance was being judged by others.
Okay.
They then tracked biological markers of stress. What they found was that individuals scoring high in covert narcissism experienced massive, disproportionate spikes in stress hormones.
Like cortisol and adrenaline.
Yes, cortisol and adrenaline.
Much higher than healthy individuals.
Significantly higher than healthy controls. And, interestingly, much higher than grandiose narcissists in the exact same situation.
Really? Why is that?
The grandiose narcissist's ego protects them somewhat from the stress of evaluation. They think they're great, so they don't care as much what the interviewer thinks. But the covert narcissist lacks that armor.
So when they face social evaluation, their bodies react as if they are facing a literal life or death physical threat.
Their nervous system is flooding their body with adrenaline over a job interview.
I want to apply this to the listener's everyday experience because I think this connects so many dots.
Go for it.
Think about a time when you offered a covert narcissist in your life a very mild piece of constructive feedback. Maybe you just pointed out a better way to load the dishwasher.
Or gently suggested they were running late.
Right, and their reaction was explosive rage. Or they burst into tears and accused you of hating them. Or they gave you the silent treatment for 3 days.
A completely disproportionate response.
You stand there thinking, it's just a dishwasher. Why are you acting like I just burned your house down?
Because to their nervous system, you did just burn their house down.
Right. When you see them lash out or withdraw like that, you are actually witnessing a nervous system that is perpetually hovering in fight or flight mode.
It's exhausting for everyone involved.
Now, I want to be incredibly clear here because this is vital. Understanding this mechanism does not excuse the abuse.
Absolutely not. It doesn't mean you have to stay and accept being screamed at.
But it finally explains the sheer baffling lack of proportion. It explains the sheer intensity of their reactions to a simple piece of feedback.
It explains why you feel like you are always walking on eggshells, because you are constantly trying to avoid triggering a nervous system that interprets any lack of perfect adoration as an existential annihilation of their identity.
But if they're in so much pain and their relationships are constantly blowing up, why does the pattern repeat?
That's the tragedy of it.
Why do they continually recreate these dramatic, conflict-heavy dynamics where they end up playing the victim?
Because it is the only way they know how to feel grounded. They are compelled to recreate dynamics where they are the absolute center of attention.
Even if it's negative attention.
Especially if it's negative. For a healthy person, peace and harmony feel safe. For a severely dysregulated covert narcissist, peace feels like a void. It feels like abandonment.
Wow. So if you are fighting with them, if you are desperately trying to soothe them, if you are agonizing over their silent treatment, then you are entirely focused on them.
Yes. To their dysregulated nervous system, being the center of your emotional focus, even if it's deeply negative attention, is the only way they know how to feel safe, validated, and in control.
That is a terrifying realization for the people caught in their orbit. And that brings us to what happens to the victims.
Yes, the collateral damage.
Because living in the blast zone of a dysregulated, covertly narcissistic nervous system does not just leave you tired, it fundamentally alters your own psychology.
It causes profound cumulative damage. The chronic invalidation, the constant emotional whiplash, the subtle gaslighting. It systematically dismantles the victim's sense of reality and their own internal stability.
And this leads us to what I think is arguably the most emotional, heavy revelation in all of this research. It's a phenomenon I know many, many people have experienced.
Clinical dread.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to describe this feeling, and if you are listening, see if this resonates. You realize your relationship is toxic. You feel like you are losing your mind. So you start looking for answers.
You start Googling toxic relationships.
You start reading articles. You start listening to deep dives into clinical psychology like this one. You learn about covert narcissism.
Yeah, and then it hits you.
And then suddenly you feel this massive gut-level clinical dread wash over you. You look at your own recent behavior. You see your own emotional volatility.
We'll see how defensive you've become.
You realize you've been angry, reactive, maybe even lashing out. And you think with absolute freezing horror, wait, am I the covert narcissist? Am I the one destroying everything?
It is an incredibly common and incredibly painful experience for individuals surviving prolonged narcissistic abuse. I see it in clinical practice constantly.
The victim is sitting on the couch, entirely convinced they are the primary abuser.
Yes.
So if a listener is sitting in their car or their living room right now, gripped by that exact fear, questioning their own sanity, and wondering if they are secretly the one with the pathology, what does the clinical science say to them?
The clinical science says to look at the nature of the dread itself. The very fact that you are experiencing genuine, sustained anxiety and deep self-doubt about being the problem is the strongest clinical evidence that you are not a narcissist.
I want you to explain that deeply, because for someone drowning in self-doubt, that distinction is a lifeline. Why does feeling like you might be a narcissist prove that you aren't one?
Because, as we discussed with the horizontal split, a pathological narcissistic personality structure is entirely organized around defending against that exact type of self-confrontation.
Right. They can't look at their own flaws.
The core feature of the disorder is the inability to tolerate shame or fault. A true narcissist rarely, if ever, experiences deep, agonizing dread that they are fundamentally at fault for the deterioration of a relationship.
Even if they apologize.
They might occasionally feign remorse as a manipulation tactic to keep you around, but they do not lose sleep over the fear that they are a bad person.
They don't have that internal agonizing.
No, they feel genuinely, fundamentally wronged by the world. Their psychological immune system instantly rejects the idea that they are the core problem.
So if you are terrified that you are the problem, if you are agonizing over your own flaws and researching how to fix yourself, your psychological immune system is functioning in a way a narcissist simply doesn't.
Exactly. You have a capacity for self-reflection that the disorder explicitly destroys.
But we still have to explain the behaviors, right? Because the victim's fear isn't coming from nowhere. They are acting defensively. They are emotionally volatile.
The behaviors are real, yes.
Why do victims start looking and acting so much like the narcissist on paper?
This is a psychological paradox, beautifully explained by a therapist and author named Pete Walker, who specializes in complex PTSD.
Oh, I love his work. What does he call it?
He coined a colloquial term for this phenomenon that is incredibly helpful. He calls it fleas.
Like the old saying, lie down with dogs, wake up with fleas.
Exactly. Fleas are the unconscious, defensive, reactive behaviors that trauma survivors absorb from living in close, sustained proximity to a personality disordered individual.
It's an adaptation.
Think about it logically. If you are constantly attacked, subtly gaslit, and emotionally manipulated for years, your nervous system is going to adapt to survive.
You are eventually going to develop extreme defensiveness.
Yes, you might withdraw emotionally and become cold to protect yourself. You might become highly reactive, angry, and seemingly self-focused because you are operating in pure survival mode.
So on the surface, the behaviors of the victim and the behaviors of the narcissist might look identical. A therapist might observe both people yelling or both people shutting down and refusing to speak.
Yes, they can look very similar phenotypically.
But the underlying engine driving the behavior is completely different.
That is the essential key to untangling this. Complex PTSD, or CPTSD, which is the trauma response victims often develop, is driven primarily by fear.
Fear of what?
It is driven by hypervigilance, a desperate fear of abandonment, and a nervous system that has been rewired by sustained emotional danger.
And what drives the narcissist?
A covert narcissism, on the other hand, is driven by entitlement. It is driven by a quiet sense of superiority, a need for control, and underlying contempt for others.
Fear versus entitlement. That is such a clarifying lens. The victim is acting out of a desperate, panicked need for psychological safety. The narcissist is acting out of a need for superiority, supply, and control.
There's another brilliant concept that builds on this from a psychoanalyst named Daniel Shaw. He writes about something called traumatized empathy.
Traumatized empathy. How does that play into the fleas concept?
Often, victims of narcissistic abuse will look at themselves and say, I used to be so compassionate, but now I don't care about anyone's problems. I'm numb. I must be a narcissist because I've lost my empathy.
That's a scary feeling.
But Shaw points out that in victims, the empathic capacity hasn't been structurally destroyed. It is simply compressed.
Compressed, like under pressure.
Yes, or temporarily rendered inaccessible by the sheer volume of unprocessed pain and emotional exhaustion.
It's like a muscle that has been overworked to the point of failure. It's still there, it just needs rest and rehabilitation.
Exactly. Whereas the structural empathy deficit in a narcissist means the effective empathy muscle was never fully developed in the first place.
I think the deeper lesson here for the listener is just incredibly liberating. If you have been living in the blast zone, you are allowed to be imperfect.
You really are.
You are allowed to be dysregulated. You are allowed to be emotionally volatile, angry, and fiercely self-protective because you have been subjected to psychological warfare. And displaying those trauma responses does not make you fundamentally disordered.
It makes you human. You are displaying brilliant, adaptive survival mechanisms that kept you alive in a toxic environment.
But they're costly.
The tragedy is that those same survival mechanisms are now costing you intimacy in your healthy relationships. But recognizing the difference means you don't have to view yourself as the villain in your own story in order to do the hard work of healing.
You can address the trauma without carrying the false label of narcissism.
Exactly.
Okay, having drawn a firm line between CPTSD trauma responses and covert narcissism, we have to make one final, incredibly crucial distinction in this deep dive.
What's that?
Because I can foresee a potential danger here. If we aren't careful, listeners are going to walk away from this material and start side-eyeing every single quiet, socially awkward, or introverted person in their life.
Ah, right. Silently diagnosing everyone as a covert narcissist.
Exactly. We need to untangle the threads of healthy introversion, social anxiety, and actual clinical narcissism.
That is a vital distinction to make, otherwise we risk pathologizing entirely normal, benign human variations.
How do we tell them apart?
Making this distinction requires looking closely at what clinicians call the phenotype. But in plain terms, we have to look under the hood at the exact motivations driving the isolation. Why is the person sitting alone in the corner?
Let's start with healthy introversion, because introversion is not a pathology, it's just a neurological temperament. The research breaks healthy introversion down into a few distinct subtypes, right?
Right, you generally see social, thinking, and restrained subtypes.
Can you break those down quickly?
Sure. A healthy social introvert, for example, genuinely prefers small, intimate groups over massive parties simply because large amounts of external stimulation are neurologically energy depleting for them.
It just tires them out.
Exactly. A thinking introvert is someone who is highly introspective. They have a rich, imaginative, internal intellectual life, and they simply enjoy spending time in their own head.
And the restrained introvert.
A restrained introvert is someone who just takes a little longer to warm up to new environments or new people. They prefer to observe the dynamics before jumping in.
And the crucial takeaway here is that none of those healthy introverts are driven by fear, deep insecurity, or a desperate desire for external validation.
No, not at all.
They aren't hiding from the world, they just genuinely prefer the quiet. I always like the battery analogy for this.
The battery analogy is great.
Think of a person's social energy as a battery. A healthy introvert goes to a party, socializes, eventually feels their battery getting low and decides to go home to recharge.
And they're perfectly content.
Right. They leave because they love peace.
Now, contrast that healthy dynamic with an anxious introvert or someone dealing with genuine social anxiety.
Right. The socially anxious person doesn't leave the party because they are content. They stay home or they hide in the corner because they are absolutely terrified that people will judge their battery.
Yes, they genuinely want to connect, they desperately want to be part of the group, but they are crippled by a feeling of social incompetence.
If a socially anxious person goes to a party, they will likely go home and spend the next 3 hours replaying every single conversation in their mind.
Agonizing over whether they sounded stupid, or if they offended someone, or if they were being judged. Their social withdrawal is rooted entirely in a fear of negative evaluation and low self-esteem.
They're punishing themselves, not others.
Precisely. But the covert narcissist, this is where the engine changes completely.
Because the covert narcissist stays home, or sits silently in the corner, radiating a dark mood, to punish the world for not worshiping their battery.
That is the exact dividing line. The hidden emotional need is entirely different.
The covert narcissist's social withdrawal is driven by what the clinical literature calls a withdrawn self-centeredness.
Yes, withdrawn self-centeredness.
They don't avoid the party because they feel inferior to the people there. They avoid the party because they believe they are fundamentally superior or uniquely special.
And they are sulking because the world isn't providing automatic, unearned adoration the moment they walk through the door.
It is an act of passive-aggressive punishment. The internal monologue is essentially, you people do not recognize my brilliance, you didn't treat me like royalty, and you are all too shallow to understand me, so I am going to deprive you of my presence.
It is a grandiose act disguised as introversion.
And if you are trying to spot this in the wild, the researchers have identified some fascinating linguistic clues to help spot this difference. It's not just how they act, it's how they speak.
Language is a huge indicator.
When researchers analyze the language patterns of covert narcissists compared to socially anxious people, what do they find?
They find some very specific subconscious tells in their speech. For instance, covert narcissists show an unusually heavy usage of first-person plural pronouns.
Like the royal we.
Yes, exactly. They frequently use we language, and they combine it with high frequency of achievement-oriented words. Words related to winning, success, intelligence, and hard work.
But why do they do that? If they are trying to play the victim, why talk about success?
It serves as a subtle, indirect method of self-promotion. Because their grandiosity is blocked by the horizontal split, they can't say, I am the smartest person at this company.
Right, that's too risky.
So instead, they hint at their accomplishments and their indispensability while maintaining a complete, plausible facade of modesty and team spirit.
So they say something like, we accomplished so much on this project, it was completely exhausting carrying the team over the finish line, but we finally got it done.
Perfect example.
On the surface, it sounds humble. It sounds like they're tired and just focused on the team, but the subtext is glaringly obvious. Look at how essential, overworked, and brilliant I am compared to everyone else.
It allows them to fish for that necessary narcissistic supply, the validation and praise, without ever taking the risk of openly bragging and facing potential criticism. It is a highly sophisticated defensive linguistic strategy.
It is brilliant in the darkest possible way. We have covered an immense amount of psychological ground today, and I think it's worth taking a moment to recap the incredible journey we've just been on.
We really have covered a lot.
We started by completely unmasking the shy narcissist, dismantling the cultural myth that grandiosity is always loud and overt.
Right.
We explored the deeply unsettling reality of cold empathy, the hypervigilant safecracker who can read the data of your pain with expert precision without ever feeling the music of it.
A crucial distinction.
We traced the trauma origins back to childhood, seeing how a lack of early emotional mirroring leads to a shattered internal structure and a parasitic reliance on others for emotional regulation.
And the severe nervous system dysregulation that comes with it.
Exactly. We hopefully provided some deep relief to the listeners by exploring the concept of fleas, proving that clinical dread and self-doubt are the ultimate proof that you are not the narcissist.
I hope that brings comfort to a lot of people.
Me too. And finally, we untangled the passive-aggressive, punishing isolation of the covert narcissist from the genuine fear-based struggles of social anxiety.
It is a profoundly complex, often devastating psychological landscape to navigate. But the first step in protecting yourself and reclaiming your own reality is simply understanding the mechanics of the machinery that is being used against you.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, we always like to leave you with a final, lingering thought. Something provocative to ponder on your own that builds on the psychology we've discussed today.
And for this topic, I think we need to look at the bigger picture. We've spent all this time examining how covert narcissists operate on a micro level in one-on-one relationships.
Right.
We've seen how they weaponize victimhood, hypersensitivity, and suffering to extract supply from the individuals closest to them. But I want you to zoom out and look at our modern digital landscape.
Oh, this is interesting.
We live in an era driven by social media algorithms where the public performance of victimhood, the display of hypersensitivity, and chronic moral outrage frequently yield massive social rewards, viral attention, and elevated status.
They literally get rewarded for it.
Yes. This raises a deeply important sociological question. If the core psychological engine of covert narcissism is the pursuit of validation and superiority through the mask of suffering, are we as a society accidentally creating a global digital ecosystem that is perfectly designed to manufacture, reward, and mass-produce narcissistic supply?
Wow. That is a thought that will fundamentally change how you view your social media feed. And it's certainly something that will keep you awake at night.
It gives you a lot to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Our mission is always to arm you with the psychological tools you need to decode human behavior, to understand the complex people around you, and most importantly, to understand yourself. Until next time.